Hi, my name is Ashley and I'm a mom of two little girls. I have a 5-year-old named Kylie and I also have a 3-year-old named Mia. So I think we can all agree that the Montessori approach is actually quite complex. It goes much deeper than just getting that perfect shelfie photo for Instagram or doing toy rotations and having your child help you with the laundry and the dishes. While those are certainly parts of it for many families, that is just scratching the surface. You know, the Montessori approach goes back over 100 years, and in that time frame, not only was it initially developed by Maria Montessori, but it has been further refined by people who have come after her. And so there's a lot more to it than most people realize. And when they first begin learning about Montessori, they may hear some things as they're going along that they misinterpret, or they might hear a completely false misconception about it and take that to be truth. And that is what I want to focus on for today's video. So from one busy parent to another, today I would like to share with you 5 of the most common misconceptions about Montessori, and we're going to debunk them. All right, so the first really common misconception is that in Montessori, children are allowed to do whatever they want. Or conversely, people will hear that Montessori is super strict and they're not allowed to do anything that they want. Now, I like to think of these two perspectives as the extremes on the end of the spectrum, where Montessori actually falls really nicely right in the middle. We are not allowing children to do whatever they like, and we are also not limiting them so much that they feel like they can't do anything. What we're actually doing in the Montessori approach is offering something that we often refer to as freedom within limits. So what exactly does that mean? It means that we're offering our children all kinds of different freedoms in their daily lives and in the classroom, if it's a Montessori classroom, but we're also setting some limits around those freedoms to make sure that we're keeping the child safe, that we're keeping other people in the environment safe, and that we're keeping the environment itself, the materials and things that they might be interacting with, also safe so that nothing is getting broken. So for example, we're offering our child the freedom to choose their own work, but we're offering them a limited number of choices. Usually about 8 to 10 different activities on a shelf at home is more than sufficient for one child, and we're storing the rest of them for a later time when we can rotate some of those things out after we notice their interest in some of the currently available things starting to wane. Or if we observe that they're developmentally ready for some new challenges, then maybe we're bringing some of those activities out and introducing those to help meet those needs. Another freedom that we offer our child is the freedom of movement. So from the moment of birth, we are doing everything in our power to prepare the environment such that they're able to move their bodies as freely as they can and to explore everything that they're physically capable of on their own unique timeline. But the limitation there is that we're making sure that that environment is appropriate for what they're able to do and that it's safe for them. And then we're also offering our child the freedom to engage with their peers and adults in their environment, and to honestly express their feelings around those interactions and what they're experiencing. But then, whenever necessary, if we see that safety might be an issue, we are stepping in and saying, I can't let you do that, but here is an acceptable alternative. Here's what you may do instead. This way, we're ensuring that our child's safe, their peers are safe, and the environment is safe. The second common misconception in Montessori is that there's no room for creativity, or that things have to be played with in a certain way. And I think this misconception stems from people understanding that Montessori guides will typically present a lesson to a child on how to use a material, and then the child is expected to practice using that material until they've eventually mastered it. And so I can see where they might think this. However, I'd like to back up for just a minute and help you understand this from a different perspective. So let's first think about the difference between open-ended and closed-ended activities. I think people traditionally tend to associate creativity with open-ended play because there are no rules. The child is allowed to use the materials, blocks, scarves, dolls, whatever it is, in any way that they want. Whereas closed-ended activities have a very distinct purpose. There is a goal in mind, usually a sequence of steps that the child has to go through in order to successfully complete the activity and to know that they've achieved that goal. For example, a puzzle, right? There really is only one way to successfully complete a jigsaw puzzle at the end of the day. So we have a very big distinction between open-ended materials and closed-ended materials. And typically in a Montessori environment, you will find a lot of these more closed-ended style tasks on the shelf for the child to do. And in a classroom, that makes perfect sense, right? Because it's an educational atmosphere. There are learning goals in mind for each of the children who are there. In a home environment, you're more apt to see a mixture of open-ended and closed-ended activities, because quite honestly, both of them are equally important for different parts of your child's development. The open-ended activities really allow your child to explore their creative side and to, explore the different possibilities of things that they could do, and to role play and some of the other things we're going to talk about in just a minute with some of the other misconceptions. But then the closed-ended activities also offer the child to experience mastery and a sense of accomplishment and working toward, like I said, accomplishing different developmental milestones. But then you might find yourself asking, okay, I'm at peace with that, but what if my child starts using the closed-ended materials in a more open-ended way? Is that something that's frowned upon in the Montessori approach? And I think this is kind of where this misconception starts to come from. And the answer is no, whereas I think a lot of people think that yes, in the Montessori approach, children are stopped from using materials in a more open-ended way, and that's actually not true. As a general rule of thumb, if a Montessori material is being used in a non-purposeful way, so not in the way that it's intended, like you might see when a child starts to experiment with a little bit of imaginary play, that is generally okay. It's acceptable as long as the child is not doing anything dangerous with it where they could hurt themselves or somebody else or potentially break the material. As long as that is not a concern, it's actually fine. I don't think I've ever heard of a Montessori guide, even in a classroom, who has said that they will go over and stop a child who is using the material in a more imaginary way. Instead, what we're actually doing is just making a mental note for ourselves when we see that happening. We're saying to ourselves, okay, why is this child using the material in this way? Because if we do notice this, it could also be a sign that the child doesn't understand the purpose of the activity. Maybe they need another demonstration of how to use it, or maybe they're just not ready for it. Maybe we thought they were and it's just a little bit too soon, and so they don't really understand how to use the material properly yet. And so when we notice this happening, again, we're not stopping it, but we're taking note for ourselves to maybe at a neutral time later to reintroduce that activity to the child and maybe model for them again how it's intended to be used. Or if we've decided that maybe it was a poor judgment call on our part and they're not quite ready for it, maybe we're just putting it away to reintroduce at a later time. All right, so the third common misconception about Montessori is that pretend play is not allowed. Now, first, let's talk about what we mean when we say pretend play, because I think there are really two different kinds of pretend play here to be considered. So the first one is this fantasy-based kind of pretend play where, they're talking about dragons and Spider-Man and monsters and things like that. But then there's this other kind, and it's more of like an imaginary role play kind of pretend play that is actually based in reality that all children experiment with. Now, in the Montessori approach, there is an emphasis on providing children under the age of 6 with a foundation of reality to help them build their understanding of the world, because it is a brand new understanding. Everything is new to them. And so we're giving them reality-based information about their world in everything that's in their environment, right down to the books that they read. And so I think this is where the misconception actually begins, because people hear about this foundation of reality and they think, oh, well, we're not allowed to do any kind of pretend play. And they kind of lump the fantasy stuff and the more natural, like role play, imaginary stuff that is based in reality, they kind of lump them together, and there isn't really a distinction between the two, and they just think it's all or none. And that's actually not the case. While we do want to steer away from some of the more fantasy-based elements, things that are not real, that the child will not find in their immediate environment, while we kind of want to steer away from that stuff, we are totally okay, at least in a Montessori home environment, with introducing the kind of imaginary role play, kind of pretend play, where the child is role playing going to the doctor or the dentist, or playing house, or pretend cooking for you. Like, all of those things are normal, everyday situations that the child experiences. and they're actually a really important part of your child's development and processing their emotions and their understanding of how the world works. It's a very natural, authentic kind of play, common to all children. And while you won't find materials to foster that kind of play in a Montessori classroom, we have to remember that the Montessori classroom is exactly that. It's a classroom. It's a learning environment. There are learning goals in mind for all of the children. In addition to that, I just want to point out, just from a historical perspective, Dr. Montessori actually did include these kinds of toys in her very first classrooms, but she noticed after lots and lots of observation that the children in her classrooms did not want to play with those things. When given the option to play with dolls or to pretend cook in a pretend kitchen versus, actual food in a real kitchen with real tools, they always preferred the real thing. And so over time, she just kind of phased out those things that were just basically left untouched in her classroom all the time. And so that's kind of how we ended up with, all of the real items and that emphasis in Montessori. But with all of that said, we are talking about Montessori at home here, not a classroom. And so it is perfectly fine to have those kinds of materials and that kind of play happening in your home alongside all of the, more closed-ended style activities that you also offer. One thing I do want to mention though is that there are many Montessori families out there, mine included, who do choose to introduce elements of fantasy to their children before the age of 6. And if you do choose to do this, that is a personal decision, but you just want to make sure that you are having those conversations with your children very clearly about the fact that these things are pretend. They're not real. So, for example, my youngest daughter has an obsession with unicorns, but she knows that they're not real. She knows that we're not going to go to a farm and find a unicorn there, much as she would love that. She knows that they're just pretend. But you have to have those conversations with your children. If you're not sitting down and saying, this does not actually exist, then they're not really going to know that for sure. We do have some understanding now that children under the age of 6 do have some ability to grasp the difference between fantasy and reality, but there are definitely still a lot of blurry lines, which is why young children are afraid of monsters in their closet and things like that. So just be mindful about it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say if you do decide to introduce fantasy. All right, moving on to the fourth common misconception, and it is that the goal of Montessori is to create little adults. It forces children to grow up too quickly and basically steals away their childhood. Now, I would venture to guess that the primary source of this misconception is that people see children in the Montessori approach doing things at a much younger age than they expect them to be able to do those things, which then leads to the incorrect assumption that Montessori, it forces children to grow up quickly and they're expected to act like little adults. And unfortunately, this stems from a couple of different things, one being societal misconceptions. Traditionally, children are viewed as highly incapable and constantly needing adult assistance. And this tends to be the case because as a society, there tends to be a general lack of understanding about early childhood development. And so we unintentionally create these environments that actually impede our child's independence. Whereas children are actually capable of doing a lot more than we realize when they have access to a thoughtfully prepared environment that fosters their autonomy. And they find pure joy in completing these tasks that they select for themselves. So in short, we're not forcing the children to be little adults or to grow up quickly. We're not forcing them to do anything really. The most common phrase that you will hear in Montessori is to follow the child, and that is for a reason. One of the actual goals of the Montessori approach is to foster the child's independence and their autonomy, but as the child shows the readiness for it. We are simply preparing the environment with developmentally appropriate opportunities for our child so that those opportunities are already in place as soon as the child is interested and ready for them. And that brings me to the fifth common misconception about Montessori, which is that we shouldn't help our child with things they can do on their own. Now, I think this misconception may actually stem from a very famous quote that you will see all over the internet related to Montessori. I think it might be one of the most famous ones. And it says, "Never help a child with a task at which he feels he can succeed." These are Dr. Montessori's own words. Now, I think the origins of this misconception begin with the very first word in this quote, never, because it's very strong language. But Dr. Montessori was a very passionate woman after all. But she didn't mean to literally never help our child. The second part of this quote is where we really need to clue in as adults. She says to never help a child with a task at which he feels he can succeed. Don't feel this need to jump in right away and take over the task for your child, especially if they're sitting there and struggling with it on their own, but they're fully involved in what they're doing. They're really focused and concentrated, and they're really trying. If they're not asking for your help, then there's a really good chance they don't want your help and they don't need your help. They might be struggling a little bit, but that's okay. That's part of the process. As adults, we have this habit of feeling like, well, if they look like they're struggling, then I should probably help them. Or maybe they're just not going fast enough. And we get impatient as the adult and we're like, here, let me just do this for you. But what message does that send to our child? That tells them that we're faster, we're better at it. And that's a really disempowering message for a child who is trying to learn how to do something for themselves for the first time. And so she's really imploring us in this quote to just wait, really try not to interfere if the child looks like he is engaged in the task and he might actually be able to do it on his own. But this doesn't mean that we're never going to help our child. There are certainly going to be times when you are going to help, and that's totally fine. But generally speaking, we want to try to refrain from intervening unless, number one, safety is a concern. That's obviously of paramount importance. We would absolutely want to step in and interrupt what they're doing and help them if they may potentially get hurt or hurt someone else. Or two, if the child looks like they're about to give up, they're super, super frustrated with what they're doing and they're just like, but we can see as the adult that there's just like one little tweak they need to make to what they're doing. Like maybe they need to turn the puzzle piece a different way or hold the shoelace with a different, finger on their hand or something. We can see that there's just like one little tiny something that maybe if we offered them a little bit of advice or show them how we do it, they might be able to get through the rest of the task on their own again. And so in those cases, we would step in and offer as much help as necessary, but as little as possible. That's another common phrase that you'll hear in Montessori, and that's what it means. Give the most minimal intervention possible to kind of help get them back on track again. And then finally, 3, if the child directly asks for our help, if they stop what they're doing and they say, "Can you help me with this?" then that is definitely an acceptable moment to say, sure, what part of it would you like help with? But again, we're looking at how we can offer the most minimal amount of help as possible so that we're not taking over the task and just doing it for them every time. But here's the bottom line. We are always going to offer our help if our child is actively requesting our help. We're never going to say no to that request. We're going to try to offer as little help as possible to get them back to doing it on their own, but sometimes we're just going to have to help our child with the whole task from A to Z. And that is completely okay, especially in the parent-child relationship. I once heard a quote from Jean-Marie Paynel from Voila Montessori in a workshop that I attended that I never forgot because it made sense to me, and I wanted to share it with you guys too. She said, think about it as an adult. We love to cook, right? Or maybe we don't love to cook, but we know how to cook for ourselves. And, we're totally capable of making a dinner for ourselves. But you know what? Every once in a while, it's nice to have somebody else cook for us. We're not in the mood. We don't feel like it. And it's nice to have, a significant other cook something nice for us. Or maybe we order takeout when that happens. But, it doesn't mean that we don't know how to cook. We're just not about it that day. And there's nothing wrong with that. As human beings, we have these kinds of moods from day to day that change. And our children are no different. And so if they're having an off day, or maybe they're just needing some more connection with you and they're asking you to brush their teeth, even though they know how to do it, it's okay to help them with that. If they need help tying their shoe because, they're really frustrated about something that was going on prior to them getting ready to leave the house, and they're like, I just want you to tie my shoe. Even though they know how to do it, it's okay to help them. There's no reason to say no. Remember, as we talked about in the fourth misconception, that we're not forcing our children to grow up too quickly. They are still children, and we recognize that. Our goal is just not to jump ahead and to assume that our children can't do something when in fact they can. But if they're asking for help, totally fine. All right, friends, so I hope you found these 5 common misconceptions about Montessori debunked to be helpful. And if you did, then be sure to give this video a thumbs up. And if you'd like more practical tips and advice for implementing Montessori at home with your children, then you might consider subscribing to my channel. This way you don't miss a new video. My new book, The Montessori Home, Create a Space for Your Child to Thrive, is now available in both paperback and ebook on Amazon and in all major book retailers. I also have several e-courses, an online community just for Montessori parents, and I also offer live video consultations. Links to all of those resources are in the description box down below. Thanks so much for watching today, and I'll see you next time. Bye.